My wife was unaware that I had just inherited $10 million before I could disclose this news. She said on my hospital bed, "I won't support a useless, jobless man," and left with a rich executive. The next day, she came back to show him off. But when he saw me, he trembled. "Honey, he is my new CEO." My wife screamed, "No way, you must be kidding. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. My name is Peter and I'm 52 years old. 3 days ago, I thought I knew everything about my life. I thought I understood my wife, my marriage, my place in the world. I was wrong about everything. The fluorescent lights in room 214 cast everything in a sickly yellow glow. The smell of disinfectant couldn't quite mask the underlying odor of human suffering that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. I'd been lying in this bed for 72 hours now, my left leg suspended in traction, my ribs wrapped tight enough to make every breath a conscious effort. The accident had been sudden. A drunk driver running a red light, my Honda Civic no match for his pickup truck, but none of that pain compared to what happened next. Abigail sat in the vinyl chair beside my bed, scrolling through her phone with the kind of detached focus she usually reserved for shopping websites. She'd been here for maybe 20 minutes total since the accident. 20 minutes in 3 days. Her auburn hair was perfectly styled, her makeup flawless despite the early hour. She wore the navy blue dress I'd bought her for her birthday last year, the one that cost $400 and made her feel sophisticated. "The insurance adjuster called," she said without looking up from her screen. Her voice had that flat, businesslike tone she used when discussing household expenses. "Total loss on the car. We'll get maybe $8,000 for it." I nodded, though the movement sent a sharp pain through my neck. $8,000. It wasn't much, but we'd manage. We always had. "That's okay. We can figure something out." She finally looked at me then, and something in her green eyes made my stomach clench. It wasn't concern or love or even basic human sympathy. It was calculation. Cold, measured assessment, like she was evaluating a broken appliance and deciding whether it was worth repairing. "Peter, we need to talk." The words hung in the air between us like a death sentence. In 15 years of marriage, nothing good had ever followed those 5 words. I tried to shift position, to sit up straighter, but the traction device held me in place. Vulnerable. Helpless. "About what?" I asked, though part of me already knew. She set her phone down on the bedside table, next to the wilted flowers her sister had brought yesterday. The card was still attached. "Get well soon, Peter. We're thinking of you." Abigail hadn't brought flowers. She'd brought complaints about the parking fees. "This accident," she began, her voice growing stronger, more confident. "It's made me realize some things about us, about our life together." My heart started beating faster, and the monitor beside my bed began beeping more rapidly. A nurse glanced through the doorway, saw Abigail, and continued walking. Everyone assumed the wife was providing comfort, support, love. They had no idea they were witnessing an execution. "Abigail, I know this is scary, but the doctors say I'll make a full recovery. 6 to 8 weeks and I'll be good as new. Better even. This whole thing has given me perspective. We can—" "You lost your job." The words hit me like a physical blow. Yes, I'd lost my job. The company had been downsizing for months, and my extended absence due to the accident had given them the excuse they needed. $65,000 a year. Gone. 15 years with the same firm, and they'd sent the termination letter to my hospital room. Delivered by courier while I was getting x-rays. "I'll find something else," I said quickly. "I have contacts, references. This is just temporary." She laughed. Actually laughed. It was a sound I'd heard 1,000 times over the years, usually when she was talking to her friends about other people's misfortunes. I'd never imagined it would be directed at me. "Peter, you're 52 years old. You've been doing the same mid-level accounting work for 20 years. Do you really think someone's going to hire you over some 30-year-old with fresh ideas and half the salary requirements?" Each word was chosen carefully, precisely, designed to cut as deeply as possible. She'd been thinking about this, planning it. This wasn't a spontaneous emotional outburst. This was premeditated. Companies value experience, I said weakly. Even I didn't believe it anymore. Companies value profit, and right now you represent nothing but expense. Medical bills, unemployment, dead weight. She stood up, smoothing her dress with the same efficient motion she used when finishing unpleasant tasks. I won't do it, Peter. I won't spend the rest of my life supporting a useless, jobless man who can't even cross a street without getting himself nearly killed. The room seemed to tilt around me. The beeping of the monitors grew louder, more insistent. Somewhere in the distance I could hear the normal sounds of a hospital functioning. Conversations, footsteps, the squeak of wheels on linoleum. Life continuing normally while mine disintegrated. "What are you saying?" My voice came out as a whisper. She picked up her purse, a leather bag that had cost more than some people's rent. "I'm saying I'm done. I filed the papers yesterday. You'll be served once you get out of here." "Divorce papers?" The word felt foreign in my mouth, like speaking a language I'd never learned. "Richard's been very supportive through all of this," she continued, as if I hadn't spoken. "He understands what it's like to be with someone who has real ambition, real drive, someone who doesn't settle for mediocrity." Richard. I knew that name. She'd mentioned him before, an executive at some company downtown. Someone she'd met at the country club we could barely afford to maintain membership in. She'd been volunteering for their charity auction, spending more and more time away from home, away from me. "You're having an affair." It wasn't a question. "I'm making a choice about my future, our future, or rather my future, since apparently we don't have one together anymore." She moved toward the door, her heels clicking against the linoleum with sharp, final sounds. Everything about her body language spoke of decision made, bridges burned, chapters closed. "Abigail, please, don't do this, not like this, not now when I need you most." She paused in the doorway, her hand on the frame. For a moment I thought I saw something flicker across her face. Regret, maybe, or second thoughts. But when she turned back to me, her expression was colder than ever. "Need me? Peter, you've needed me to carry you financially for years. You've needed me to make excuses for your lack of ambition to our friends. You've needed me to pretend that being married to an accountant who peaked in his 30s was some kind of achievement." Her voice rose slightly, loud enough that I was certain people in the hallway could hear. "Well, I'm done being needed by someone who has nothing to offer in return." The cruelty of it took my breath away. Not just the words themselves, but the timing, the location, the calculated precision of delivering this blow when I was literally unable to get up and walk away, when I was trapped, dependent, at my most vulnerable. 15 years, I managed to say. 15 years, and this is how it ends? She shrugged, the gesture so casual it was obscene. 15 years I'll never get back. But I'm 47, not 77. I still have time to build something real with someone who actually has potential. The door to my room swung shut behind her with a soft, hydraulic hiss. I stared at it for a long time, waiting for her to come back, to tell me this was some kind of misunderstanding, some stress-induced breakdown she'd regret in the morning. But the door stayed closed. Outside my window I could see the parking lot 4 floors below. After about 10 minutes I watched Abigail walk to her car. Our car, technically, though I suppose that would change soon, too. She moved with purpose, confidence, like someone who'd just solved a difficult problem. At the car, she paused to check her reflection in the window, adjusting her hair before getting in. She drove away without looking back at the hospital, without any sign that she was leaving behind 15 years of shared life, shared dreams, shared promises that apparently meant nothing. I closed my eyes and tried to remember the woman I'd fallen in love with all those years ago, the young teacher who'd laughed at my terrible jokes, who'd said she loved how stable and reliable I was, how refreshing it was to be with a man who didn't need to prove anything to anyone. That woman had vanished so gradually I hadn't noticed her disappearing, replaced by this stranger who saw me as nothing more than a failed investment. The afternoon stretched endlessly. Nurses came and went, checking vitals, adjusting medications, speaking in those careful professional tones. Reserved for patients, they pitied. Word had gotten around somehow. Hospital staff have their own gossip networks, and dramatic scenes don't stay private long. Sarah, the day shift nurse, who'd been especially kind since my arrival, brought me dinner around 6. She set the tray down gently and gave me a look that somehow managed to convey sympathy without pity. "Sometimes," she said quietly, "the worst thing that happens to us turns out to be the best thing that could have happened. You just can't see it yet." I wanted to believe her, but lying there in that narrow hospital bed, abandoned by the woman I'd built my entire adult life around, it was impossible to imagine anything good coming from this devastation. As the evening wore on and visiting hours ended, I found myself thinking about my Uncle Harold. My father's brother, a man I'd barely known but who'd always sent Christmas cards with $20 bills tucked inside, even after I was grown. He'd died 6 months ago, and I'd been too busy with work and Abigail's social obligations to attend the funeral. Another regret to add to the growing pile. The phone calls would start tomorrow. Friends asking about the accident, then gradually learning about the divorce. Some would take sides, most would drift away. 15 years of shared social connections, all about to evaporate. I'd have to find a new place to live, probably some studio apartment I could afford on unemployment benefits. I'd have to start over at 52, damaged goods in a young man's job market. But as I lay there in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the hospital settling into its nighttime rhythm, one thought kept returning. Abigail had revealed herself completely in those awful minutes by my bedside. The mask had finally slipped, and I'd seen what was underneath. Someone capable of breathtaking cruelty, someone who could walk away from an injured spouse without a backward glance. Maybe Sarah was right. Maybe this was the best thing that could have happened. As the elevator doors had closed behind her, taking her out of my life forever, I realized that 15 years of my life had just ended. But something else was beginning. The next morning arrived with the mechanical precision that only hospitals can manage. Shift change at 7, breakfast at 8, doctor's rounds at 9, everything scheduled, predictable, safe. Unlike my life, which had imploded in the span of 20 minutes the day before, I hadn't slept much. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard Abigail's voice saying those words, "Useless, jobless man." The worst part wasn't the cruelty, it was the matter-of-fact way she'd delivered it, like she was stating an obvious truth that everyone could see but me. Dr. Martinez stopped by around 10:30. He was a good man, probably 5 years younger than me, with the kind of confident competence that made you trust him immediately. He checked my charts, examined my leg, and nodded with satisfaction. "You're healing faster than expected," he said, making notes on his tablet. "The physical therapy team will start working with you tomorrow. If everything continues this well, we should have you out of here by the end of the week." Out of here, and going where? I didn't ask the question aloud, but he must have seen something in my expression. "Is everything all right at home? You seem troubled." I almost laughed. Troubled. Such a gentle word for having your life destroyed by the person you trusted most in the world. "My wife and I are separating," I said, testing the words. They felt strange, unreal. "She was here yesterday to tell me she's filing for divorce." Dr. Martinez's pen paused above his tablet. "I'm sorry to hear that. The timing is particularly difficult." That was one way to put it. Another way was that my wife had waited until I was literally helpless to deliver the killing blow, ensuring maximum damage with minimum risk of confrontation. "Do you have other family, friends who can help during your recovery?" The question hit harder than it should have. Abigail and I had lived a careful, curated life. Her friends from the country club, my colleagues from work, couples we saw at dinner parties and charity events, all superficial connections built around our identity as a married couple. Without that identity, what was left? "I'll figure something out," I said. After he left, I spent the morning thinking about how I'd gotten here. Not the accident, that was just random bad luck, but the slow erosion that had brought my marriage to the point where my wife could abandon me without apparent regret. I remembered the early years when Abigail still taught elementary school and we lived in a cramped two-bedroom apartment. She'd been different then, softer, more generous with her affections. Or maybe I'd just been too young and optimistic to see the warning signs. The changes had been gradual. First, she'd grown dissatisfied with our apartment, then with my salary, then with our social circle. Each step up the ladder of respectability had cost us something. Money we didn't have, time we couldn't afford, compromises that slowly chipped away at who we really were. I'd gone along with it all because I loved her, because I thought making her happy was the same thing as building a life together. The country club membership that cost $1,800 a year, the house in the right neighborhood that stretched our budget to the breaking point, the constant pressure to upgrade, everything, clothes, cars, vacations, to maintain the image she felt we needed to project. And for what? So that when I became inconvenient, she could discard me for someone with better prospects? Around noon, Sarah brought my lunch and sat down in the visitor's chair. It was unusual. Nurses were always busy, always moving, but she had the afternoon look of someone who'd made a deliberate choice to take a few extra minutes. "How are you holding up?" she asked. "Been better," I admitted. She nodded. "I've seen this before, you know. People who think they're dealing with a medical crisis, and then they discover they're actually dealing with a life crisis. Sometimes the accident or illness just reveals what was already broken." 15 years, I said. 15 years and I never really knew her. Or maybe you did know her and you just didn't want to admit it to yourself. The truth of that hit me like ice water. How many times had I made excuses for Abigail's behavior? How many cruel comments had I rationalized as stress or justified as ambition? How many times had she shown me exactly who she was, only for me to convince myself I'd misunderstood? She was already planning this, I said, more to myself than to Sarah. The divorce papers, her relationship with this other man, she'd been planning it for months, maybe years, and I never saw it coming. "Some people are very good at hiding their true nature," Sarah said gently, "especially from people who love them and want to believe the best." After she left, I found myself remembering specific moments with new clarity. The way Abigail's eyes would light up when she talked to Richard at charity events, while she barely managed polite smiles for my stories. How she'd started working late more often, always with plausible explanations. The gradual decrease in physical affection, explained away as stress or fatigue or just the natural evolution of a long marriage. The signs had been there. I'd just chosen not to see them. Around 3 in the afternoon, my phone rang. Unknown number, with a local area code. Normally, I would have ignored it, probably a telemarketer or wrong number, but lying in a hospital bed with nothing but time and devastating revelations for company, I answered. "Is this Peter Michael Hartley?" The voice was formal, professional, a man probably in his 60s. "Yes, this is Peter." "Mr. Hartley, my name is William Crawford. I'm an attorney with Crawford and Associates here in town. I've been trying to reach you regarding your Uncle Harold's estate." Uncle Harold? I sat up straighter, immediately regretting the sharp pain in my ribs. "I'm sorry, I should have returned your calls. I've been dealing with some personal issues." "I understand you were in an accident. I hope you're recovering well." "Getting there. Listen, Mr. Crawford, I appreciate you calling, but I'm not really in a position to discuss estate matters right now, if there are any debts or obligations." "Mr. Hartley," he interrupted gently, "I think you may have misunderstood the nature of this call. Your Uncle Harold left you something in his will, something quite substantial." I frowned. Uncle Harold had been a nice enough man, but he'd lived simply. A small house, a modest pension from 30 years at the post office. I'd always assumed he had just enough to get by. "What kind of something?" There was a pause, the kind of calculated silence that lawyers use when they're about to deliver important information. "Mr. Hartley, your uncle was a very private man, but also a very shrewd investor. Over the past 40 years, he quietly built quite a portfolio. Real estate, stocks, bonds. He lived well below his means and invested the difference." My heart started beating faster. "What are you saying?" I'm saying that your Uncle Harold left you his entire estate. After taxes and legal fees, you're looking at approximately $10 million. The words hit me like a physical shock. $10 million. I actually looked around the hospital room as if somehow the number might be written on the walls, might make more sense in a different context. I'm sorry, did you say 10 million? 10,200,000 to be more precise. There are some specific conditions and instructions that we'll need to discuss, but yes, Mr. Hartley, you are now a very wealthy man. I couldn't speak. The phone felt heavy in my hand, and I had to grip it tighter to keep from dropping it. $10 million. More money than I'd ever imagined having, more than Abigail and I had ever dreamed of. Abigail. The irony was so sharp it almost made me laugh. Yesterday, she'd left me because I was a financial liability, a burden she couldn't afford to carry. Today, I was worth more than Richard probably made in a lifetime. Mr. Hartley, are you still there? Yes, sorry, it's a lot to process. I understand completely. When would be a good time to meet and go over the details? There are quite a few assets to transfer and some legal documents that require your signature. I thought about telling him I was in the hospital, but something stopped me. Some instinct for privacy, for keeping this information contained until I could figure out what it meant. Could we meet early next week? I'm between locations right now. Of course, why don't I call you Monday morning and we can set something up? After I hung up, I lay back against the pillows, staring at the ceiling. $10 million. The number kept echoing in my mind like a song I couldn't stop humming. The timing was almost cosmic in its cruelty and justice. If Abigail had waited just one more day, if she'd shown even a shred of loyalty or compassion, she would have been part of this windfall. Instead, she'd chosen to abandon ship just before it reached the promised land. But as the afternoon wore on, I realized something else. I was glad she didn't know. Glad. She'd revealed her true nature before money could complicate things further. Because now I knew with absolute certainty that her feelings for me had nothing to do with love and everything to do with calculation. She'd spent 15 years evaluating me as an investment, and when she decided I was underperforming, she'd moved her assets elsewhere. The only difference between Abigail and Richard was that Richard had a better portfolio. But here was what she didn't know, what no one knew. I'd just become a very different kind of investment altogether. As evening approached and the hospital settled into its quieter nighttime rhythm, I found myself thinking about the future in a way I hadn't in years. Not the careful, budgeted future that Abigail and I had planned around our modest income and middle-class aspirations, but a wide-open future, full of possibilities I'd never dared to consider. I could travel. I could start my own business. I could take risks, pursue dreams I'd put on hold for decades. I could help people, really help them, not just write checks to Abigail's preferred charities for the tax deduction and social status. But first, I had to get out of this hospital bed. I had to heal physically and emotionally. And then I had to decide what to do with this information, this incredible secret that changed everything. The phone number for the lawyer was saved in my contacts now. $10 million was sitting somewhere in accounts and investments, waiting for my signature to make it official. And Abigail was somewhere across town with Richard, probably planning their future together, completely unaware that the useless, jobless man she'd discarded was now worth more than both of them combined. The irony would have been funny if it wasn't so devastating. But as I drifted off to sleep that night, I realized something important. I wasn't planning revenge. I wasn't plotting some elaborate scheme to make Abigail regret her choice. I was planning freedom. $10 million meant I never had to depend on anyone again. It meant I could build a life based on my own values, my own choices, my own definition of success. It meant I could find out who Peter Hartley really was when he wasn't trying to live up to someone else's expectations. And that realization was worth more than all the money in the world. I'd been discharged from the hospital for exactly 3 days when they showed up at my doorstep. 3 days of quiet recovery in the small furnished apartment I'd rented while the lawyers sorted out my inheritance. 3 days of peace, of sleeping without interruption, of beginning to imagine what my new life might look like. The knock came at exactly 2:30 in the afternoon. I knew because I'd been watching the clock, waiting for my appointment with William Crawford at 4. We were finally going to finalize the paperwork that would make the $10 million officially mine. I wasn't expecting visitors. The few people who had my new address were my lawyer, my doctor, and the rental office. So when I opened the door and saw Abigail standing there in a cream-colored dress I'd never seen before, my first thought was that something terrible had happened. My second thought was about the man standing beside her. Richard Donovan looked exactly like what he was: successful, polished, expensive, probably 45, with silver threading through his dark hair in a way that suggested distinction rather than age. His suit was tailored, his watch was Swiss, and his smile was the kind that had been practiced in 1,000 boardroom meetings. "Hello, Peter," Abigail said, her voice carrying a tone I'd never heard before. Not the cold dismissal from the hospital, but something almost triumphant. "I hope you don't mind us dropping by. We were in the neighborhood." They were in the neighborhood. My temporary apartment was in a working-class area across town from everywhere Abigail usually went. The only reason she'd be in this neighborhood was to see me. "What do you want, Abigail?" I asked, not moving from the doorway. "Can we come in? There are some things we need to discuss." She gestured to Richard like she was presenting a prize. "I'd like you to meet Richard Donovan properly." I considered closing the door. I considered telling them both to leave, but something in Abigail's demeanor made me curious. She was practically glowing with satisfaction, like someone who just won a particularly important game. I stepped aside and let them in. My temporary living space was a far cry from the house we'd shared. One bedroom, basic furniture, windows that looked out onto a parking lot rather than our old neighborhood's tree-lined streets. But it was clean, quiet, and most importantly, it was mine. Abigail's eyes swept the room with barely concealed disdain. "Well," she said, settling onto the couch like she was being careful not to touch anything contaminated, "this is cozy." Richard remained standing, hands clasped behind his back, studying me with the kind of professional assessment that successful people use when meeting someone they consider beneath their notice. His presence filled the small room in a way that seemed intentional, calculated to make me feel small. "I understand you've been through a difficult time," he said, his voice smooth and practiced. "Recovery from an accident like that can't be easy, especially with all the other adjustments you're facing. Other adjustments, like losing my job, my wife, my home, my entire life as I'd known it." "I'm managing," I said. Abigail laughed, the sound sharp and brittle. "Are you? Because from what I can see, you're living in a studio apartment and collecting unemployment benefits. That doesn't exactly scream managing to me." There it was, the real reason for this visit. She'd come to gloat, to show me what I'd lost and what she'd gained, to parade her new man in front of me and make sure I understood how much better off she was without me. "Why are you here, Abigail?" She reached over and took Richard's hand, interlacing their fingers with deliberate theatricality. "We're here because we're getting married, and I thought you should know before you heard it from someone else." The words should have hurt. A week ago, they would have destroyed me. But sitting there in my small, quiet apartment, knowing what I knew about my changed circumstances, I felt nothing but a mild curiosity about her motivations. "Congratulations," I said. She blinked, clearly expecting a different reaction. "That's it? Congratulations? What did you expect me to say?" Richard squeezed her hand and gave her a look that was probably meant to be supportive but came across as condescending. "Abigail was concerned that you might be struggling with the transition. She wanted to make sure you understood that this isn't personal." "Not personal. The woman I'd been married to for 15 years was marrying another man 3 weeks after leaving me in a hospital bed, and it wasn't personal." "Of course," I said. "Business decision, right?" Abigail's cheeks flushed slightly. "Don't be crude, Peter. Richard and I have a real connection. Something mature, something based on shared goals and compatible lifestyles." "Compatible bank accounts, you mean?" Richard's expression hardened. I think you're being unfair. Abigail is a remarkable woman who deserves to be with someone who can provide for her properly, someone with ambition and prospects. The irony was so thick I almost choked on it. Here was Richard, lecturing me about providing for Abigail while $10 million sat in accounts waiting for my signature. If only he knew that the unsuccessful man he was patronizing had more money than he'd probably see in his lifetime. But I wasn't ready to reveal that card yet. Something about this whole performance felt wrong, too orchestrated, too deliberately cruel. Abigail could have simply called to tell me about the engagement. She could have sent a text, an email, a message through lawyers. Instead, she'd driven across town to deliver the news in person, with Richard in tow like a trophy. "Tell me about yourself, Richard," I said, settling back in my chair. "What is it you do?" He straightened, clearly pleased to have the conversation shift to his accomplishments. "I'm Senior Vice President of Operations at Meridian Dynamics. We're a mid-sized corporation focused on logistics and supply chain management. 500 employees, 42 million in annual revenue." He delivered the statistics with the precision of someone who'd memorized them for exactly this kind of moment. Someone who defined himself by numbers and titles and his position in corporate hierarchies. "Impressive," I said. "And you met Abigail at the country club?" "At a charity auction," Abigail interjected, her voice taking on the dreamy quality she used when recounting romantic stories. "Richard bid on a weekend getaway package, and we started talking about travel, about the places we'd both like to visit. We discovered we had so much in common." What they had in common was a shared appetite for the finer things in life and the ambition to acquire them. What they had in common was the belief that success could be measured in dollars and status symbols. "How long have you been seeing each other?" I asked, though I was pretty sure I already knew the answer. They exchanged a look. "We've been friends for almost a year," Richard said carefully, "but we didn't begin a romantic relationship until after Abigail made her decision about your marriage." A year. They'd been friends for a year, while Abigail was still sharing my bed, still signing our joint tax returns, still wearing the wedding ring I'd saved for 3 months to buy. "I see," I said. "It's not what you think," Abigail said quickly. "Richard was a friend when I needed one, someone I could talk to about my frustrations with our marriage. He helped me realize that I deserved better." Better. There was that word again, the one that had justified every cruelty, every betrayal, every calculated step away from our shared life. Richard checked his watch, a Rolex, naturally. "We should probably get going, darling. We have dinner reservations at Le Bernardin at 7. Le Bernardin, the most expensive restaurant in the city, where dinner for two could easily cost $500. The kind of place Abigail had always wanted to go, but we'd never been able to afford on my accountant's salary. She stood up, smoothing her dress with the same efficient motion she'd always used when ending conversations that had served their purpose. "We wanted to deliver the news personally because, despite everything, I did care about you once, Peter. I want you to know that I hope you find happiness, even if it's not the kind of happiness I need." The kind of happiness she needed apparently required a 6-figure income and a man who could afford to take her to restaurants with names she could pronounce to her friends at the country club. "I appreciate that," I said, standing to walk them to the door. At the threshold, Abigail paused and looked back at me. For just a moment, her expression softened into something that might have been genuine regret. "You're a good man, Peter. You weren't the right man for me." And then they were gone, walking toward Richard's silver BMW parked in front of my building. I watched from the window as he opened the passenger door for her, as she settled into leather seats that probably cost more than my monthly rent. As they drove away, I felt a strange sense of completion. The last chapter of my old life had officially closed. Abigail had gotten what she wanted, a man who could provide the lifestyle she felt she deserved. Richard had gotten what he wanted, a beautiful wife who would look good at corporate functions and enhance his image of success. And I had gotten something neither of them could imagine: freedom. At 4 o'clock sharp, I met with William Crawford in his downtown office. The paperwork was extensive but straightforward: signatures, account transfers, investment portfolios that would need to be reviewed and managed. By 5:30, I was officially worth $10,200,000. Walking back to my car, I passed Le Bernardin. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see couples in expensive clothes enjoying expensive meals, secure in their expensive lives. Somewhere in there, Abigail was probably describing our meeting to Richard, probably laughing about how pathetic I'd looked in my small apartment, how obvious it was that she'd made the right choice. Let her laugh. Let them both toast their superior judgment and their bright future together. Because tomorrow morning I was going to do something that would change everything. I was going to accept the position that William Crawford had mentioned in passing during our meeting, the opportunity to purchase a controlling interest in a small but growing company that needed new leadership and fresh capital. The company was called Meridian Dynamics, and according to the financial documents Crawford had shown me, Richard Donovan was about to get a very big surprise when he met his new boss. The irony was perfect, almost too good to be true. But sometimes life arranges itself in ways that seem scripted for maximum dramatic impact. Sometimes the universe has a sense of humor that borders on the malicious. I drove home through the evening traffic, past the billboards and office buildings where people like Richard worked and schemed and climbed their careful ladders toward success. None of them knew that an unsuccessful accountant in a small apartment had just become one of the wealthiest men in the city. But they were about to find out. The boardroom on the 32nd floor of the Meridian Dynamics building was designed to intimidate. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city, while the polished mahogany table could seat 20 people comfortably. Original artwork lined the walls, and everything from the leather chairs to the coffee service spoke of corporate power and success. I'd been in rooms like this before, but always as a visitor, always as someone seeking approval or delivering reports to people who held my professional fate in their hands. Today was different. Today I sat at the head of the table as the new majority owner of Meridian Dynamics. The purchase had taken exactly 1 week to finalize. William Crawford's contacts in the investment community had made the process surprisingly smooth. The previous owner, a man named Harrison Mitchell, had been looking for an exit strategy for months. His children had no interest in running the company, and he was tired of the day-to-day operations. My offer of $12 million for a 65% stake had been accepted within 48 hours. Now I owned the company where Richard Donovan worked, where he'd built his career, his reputation, his sense of self-worth, where he earned the salary that had made him attractive to my ex-wife. The irony was so perfect it almost felt like cheating. Harrison Mitchell sat to my right, a distinguished man in his late 60s who'd agreed to stay on as a consultant for 6 months to help with the transition. Across from us sat the senior management team, 5 executives who'd been running various aspects of the business and were now wondering what changes the new ownership might bring. Richard wasn't here yet. I'd specifically requested that the senior vice president of operations be excluded from this initial meeting. I wanted to understand the company's structure and dynamics before dealing with him directly. As I mentioned when we spoke yesterday, Harrison was saying, Meridian has been profitable for the past 8 years running. Our client base is solid, our reputation in the industry is excellent, and our employee retention rates are well above average. I nodded, reviewing the financial documents spread across the table. The numbers were impressive. Annual revenue of $42 million, as Richard had mentioned, with profit margins that many companies would envy. This wasn't a struggling business that needed saving. It was a successful operation that simply needed new leadership. Tell me about the management structure, I said. Who are the key players I should know about? Harrison gestured to a woman in her early 50s sitting across from us. Margaret Chen, our chief financial officer. She's been with us for 12 years and knows our financial position better than anyone. Margaret nodded politely. She had the focused intensity of someone who dealt in facts and figures, someone who understood that numbers didn't lie or flatter or manipulate. David Rodriguez, head of human resources, Harrison continued, indicating a younger man with prematurely gray hair. He's been instrumental in maintaining our company culture and employee satisfaction levels. Then Harrison's expression shifted slightly, becoming more guarded. And Richard Donovan, our Senior Vice President of Operations. He's been with the company for 7 years and oversees most of our day-to-day logistics operations. What can you tell me about Mr. Donovan's performance? I asked, keeping my voice neutral. Harrison and Margaret exchanged a quick glance. It was David who answered. Richard is ambitious. He's effective at managing his department, and our clients generally respond well to him, but he can be challenging to work with internally. Challenging how? Margaret leaned forward. Richard tends to view the company hierarchy as a ladder he's climbing rather than a team he's part of. He's made it clear that he sees himself as Harrison's eventual successor, and he sometimes acts with more authority than his position technically warrants. This was interesting. In the week since I'd become owner of Meridian Dynamics, I'd been researching not just the company's financial health, but the personalities and dynamics of its leadership team. Richard's file painted a picture of someone who was competent but politically ambitious, someone who confused personal advancement with company success. Has his attitude created problems with other departments? I asked. David nodded. We've had several complaints from other department heads about Richard overstepping his boundaries. He has a tendency to make decisions that should be collaborative and then present them as fait accompli. It was exactly the kind of behavior I would have expected from someone who saw Abigail as a prize to be won, who viewed relationships in terms of acquisitions and strategic advantages. I'd like to meet with each department head individually over the next few days, I said. Starting with Mr. Donovan, can we set that up for tomorrow morning? Harrison made a note. Of course. Should I give him any specific information about the purpose of the meeting? Just tell him that the new owner wants to get acquainted with senior management. As the meeting wrapped up and the executives filed out, Harrison lingered behind. He had the expression of someone who wanted to say something but wasn't sure how to begin. Is there something else we should discuss? I asked. He was quiet for a moment, then looked directly at me. Peter, I don't know what your personal situation is, and it's none of my business, but when Richard learns that you're his new boss... He paused, choosing his words carefully. Let's just say he's going to be very surprised. You know about my connection to him? Harrison nodded. Small business community. Word gets around about who's dating whom, especially when marriages end and new relationships begin. Richard has been quite public about his relationship with your ex-wife. Of course he had. Men like Richard didn't date women like Abigail in secret. They displayed them like trophies, proof of their success and desirability. I appreciate you telling me, I said. But whatever personal history there might be, this is a business decision. I'm here because Meridian Dynamics is a good investment, not because of any individual employee. Harrison smiled. I believe that. But I also think tomorrow's meeting is going to be very interesting. That evening, I sat in my small apartment, reviewing Richard's personnel file and thinking about the conversation ahead. His salary was $120,000 a year, exactly what Abigail had mentioned during their visit. Good money, certainly, but not the kind of wealth that justified the arrogance I'd witnessed. His performance reviews were consistently positive, but not exceptional. He met his targets, managed his department adequately, and generated no major complaints from clients, but there was nothing in his record that suggested exceptional leadership or vision. He was, in every sense, a competent middle manager who'd reached his level of capability, which made his condescension toward me all the more galling. He'd looked at my circumstances, unemployed, injured, abandoned by my wife, and seen proof of his own superiority. He'd measured his worth against mine and found himself wanting to lecture me about ambition and prospects. Tomorrow, that dynamic was about to change in a way he couldn't possibly imagine. I went to bed early and slept better than I had in weeks. Richard arrived at 9:15 the next morning, 15 minutes late for our 9 o'clock appointment. It was a small power play, the kind of calculated disrespect that successful people sometimes use to establish dominance over those they consider beneath them. I was waiting in the main conference room, sitting at the far end of the table with my back to the windows so that anyone entering would be silhouetted against the morning light. It was a subtle psychological advantage, but in a conversation like this, every advantage mattered. When Richard walked through the door, I had my head down reviewing documents. He cleared his throat to announce his presence, but I didn't look up immediately. Let him wait. Let him wonder. "Mr. Donovan," I said finally, raising my eyes to meet his. "Thank you for coming." The recognition hit him like a physical blow. His face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, shock, and finally something close to panic. He actually took a step backward, as if he'd walked into the wrong room by mistake. "Peter." His voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "Please sit down," I said, gesturing to the chair across from me. "We have a lot to discuss." He remained standing, gripping the back of the chair like it was the only thing keeping him upright. "I don't understand. What are you doing here? How am I— What, Richard? How are you in the boardroom of my company?" My company. Interesting choice of words from someone who owned exactly 0% of Meridian Dynamics. "Please sit down," I repeated, my voice calm but carrying the unmistakable tone of authority. This time he obeyed, sinking into the chair with the mechanical movement of someone whose world had just shifted fundamentally. His hands trembled slightly as he placed them on the table. "I don't understand what's happening," he said. "I'm sure it's confusing," I acknowledged. "Let me explain. As of last Friday, I am the majority owner of Meridian Dynamics. I now control 65% of the company with full authority over all personnel and operational decisions." The color drained from his face completely. "That's impossible. You're unemployed. You live in a studio apartment. You collect unemployment benefits." "Did collect unemployment benefits," I corrected. "Past tense. I'm now the owner of a $42 million company that employs 500 people, including you." He shook his head like he was trying to dislodge water from his ears. "This has to be some kind of mistake. Some kind of joke." I reached across the table and slid a folder toward him. Merger documents, signed and notarized, stock certificates showing my ownership percentage, bank records showing the $12 million I paid for controlling interest. Would you like to review them? He stared at the folder as if it contained a bomb. His breathing had become shallow, rapid, and a thin sheen of sweat was visible on his forehead despite the air-conditioned coolness of the room. $12 million? He repeated. "Where did you get $12 million? That's not really your concern, is it? What is your concern is how this change in ownership affects your position here at Meridian." The word position seemed to snap him back to some semblance of focus. This was territory he understood: office politics, corporate hierarchy, the careful dance of professional survival. "Are you going to fire me?" he asked bluntly. It was a fair question, and honestly the thought had occurred to me. It would be poetic justice, wouldn't it? Richard had taken my wife. I could take his livelihood. He'd lectured me about ambition and prospects. I could show him what real power looked like. But as I looked at him sitting there, sweating and shaking in his expensive suit, I realized that firing him would be too easy, too quick, too merciful. "That depends entirely on you," I said. "What do you mean?" "I mean that your continued employment here will be based on your performance and your ability to adapt to new management, just like any other employee." The relief that flickered across his face was almost pathetic. He'd been expecting the worst, and anything short of immediate termination probably seemed like salvation. "Of course," he said quickly. "I've always been a team player. Ask anyone in the company. I follow directions, I meet my targets, "Richard," I interrupted quietly. He stopped talking immediately. "3 weeks ago, you came to my apartment with my ex-wife to announce your engagement. Do you remember what you said to me?" His Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard. We were just— "You told me that Abigail deserved to be with someone who could provide for her properly, someone with ambition and prospects." I leaned forward slightly. "Do you still stand by that assessment?" The trap was perfect, and we both knew it. If he said yes, he was insulting his new boss. If he said no, he was admitting that his previous judgment had been wrong. "I think I may have misjudged the situation," he said carefully. "May have?" "I definitely misjudged the situation." I nodded approvingly. "That's a good start. Because here's what's going to happen, Richard. You're going to continue in your current role, reporting to me through the same chain of command that's always existed. You're going to do your job competently and professionally, and you're going to remember every single day that the man you dismissed as unsuccessful and without prospects is the one who signs your paychecks." The power dynamic had shifted so completely that it was almost surreal. A week ago, this man had stood in my apartment and patronized me about my lack of ambition. Now he was begging for the privilege of remaining employed by me. "I understand," he said quietly. "Good. Now let's talk about your department's performance metrics for the last quarter." The rest of the meeting proceeded with professional efficiency. Richard provided reports, answered questions, and demonstrated the kind of eager cooperation that comes from a man who'd just discovered his professional survival depended on pleasing someone he'd recently humiliated. As he prepared to leave, I had one final card to play. "Oh, and Richard? When you see Abigail tonight, please give her my congratulations on your engagement. I'm sure she'll be very happy to hear about today's developments." He paused at the door, his shoulders sagging with the weight of what he'd have to explain to his fiancée. The woman who'd left me because I was a financial liability was about to learn that her unemployed ex-husband was now her future husband's boss. The irony was perfect, almost too perfect to believe. But sometimes, life writes itself with a sense of poetic justice that no novelist would dare attempt. The call came at exactly 7:43 that evening. I was in my apartment reviewing financial projections for Meridian Dynamics and enjoying the quiet satisfaction of my new reality when my phone rang with a number I recognized but hadn't expected to see so soon: Abigail. I let it ring 4 times before answering, savoring the moment. Whatever conversation was about to happen, it would be very different from our last encounter. "Hello, Abigail. What the hell did you do?" Her voice was sharp, bordering on hysterical. Gone was the composed, triumphant woman who'd paraded Richard through my apartment just over a week ago. This was someone whose carefully constructed world had just collapsed. "I'm not sure what you mean." "Don't play games with me, Peter. Richard came home tonight and told me what happened. How is this possible? How do you own his company?" I could hear her breathing heavily on the other end of the line, could picture her pacing around whatever expensive space she and Richard now shared. The control she'd wielded so effortlessly during our marriage, the calm superiority she'd displayed when abandoning me in the hospital, had evaporated completely. "It's quite simple, actually. I bought it." "With what money? You were unemployed. You were collecting benefits." "I inherited some assets from my Uncle Harold. You remember him, don't you? The one whose funeral we skipped because you had that charity luncheon you didn't want to miss." There was a long pause. Could almost hear her mind racing, trying to piece together the implications. "How much?" she asked finally, her voice smaller now, more uncertain. "How much what? How much money are we talking about?" The "we" was telling. Even after abandoning me, after filing for divorce, after announcing her engagement to another man, some part of her still thought of my assets as somehow connected to her. "Enough," I said simply. "Peter, please. I need to know. This affects everything. Richard's job, our future together, your future together," I corrected. "I'm not part of that equation anymore, remember? You made that very clear in the hospital. That was different. I was scared, overwhelmed. I wasn't thinking clearly." Now we were getting somewhere. The mask was slipping, revealing the calculating mind underneath. Abigail wasn't calling because she felt guilty about how she'd treated me. She was calling because the financial equation had changed and she needed to recalculate her position. "You seemed to be thinking very clearly when you brought Richard to my apartment to announce your engagement. I know how that must have looked, but..." "How it looked? Abigail, you left me in a hospital bed. You told me I was useless and jobless. You filed divorce papers while I was recovering from an accident. How exactly should that have looked?" The silence stretched between us, heavy with 15 years of unspoken truths finally being acknowledged. "I made mistakes," she said finally. "But it's not too late to fix this. The divorce isn't final yet. We could work things out, go to counseling, start over." And there it was. The real reason for the call. Not remorse, not love, not genuine regret for the cruelty she'd shown. Just a desperate attempt to reposition herself now that the financial landscape had shifted. "What about Richard?" I asked. He was a mistake, a reaction to the problems in our marriage, but those problems can be solved now. Everything's different. Everything's different. Because now I had money. Now I had power. Now I was worth her time and effort again. "You want to call off your engagement? I want us to try again. I want to fix what went wrong between us." The pathetic desperation in her voice should have satisfied me. For weeks I'd fantasized about a moment like this when Abigail would realize what she'd thrown away and come crawling back. But sitting there listening to her, I felt nothing but a cold kind of pity. "Meet me tomorrow," I said. 1 o'clock at Cafe Luna downtown. We'll talk." "Thank you, Peter. Thank you for giving us another chance." Us. There was no us anymore, and tomorrow she was going to learn that in the most definitive way possible. Cafe Luna was busy at lunchtime, filled with business people and shoppers taking a break from their day. I arrived early and chose a table near the windows where we'd have privacy, but wouldn't be completely isolated. What I had to say needed witnesses, needed the normal bustle of life continuing around us. Abigail arrived exactly on time, which was unusual for her. Punctuality had never been one of her strengths, but desperation apparently made her more considerate of other people's schedules. She wore a black dress that I recognized, one I'd bought her for our 10th anniversary. The symbolism wasn't subtle. She slid into the chair across from me, her hands nervous and fluttering as she arranged her purse and removed her sunglasses. Even in her anxiety, she was beautiful. That hadn't changed. What had changed was my ability to be manipulated by that beauty. "Thank you for meeting me," she said, her voice softer than it had been on the phone. "I know this is awkward." Awkward is one word for it. A waiter approached and we ordered coffee. Small talk about the weather, the crowded restaurant, anything to avoid the real conversation. But eventually the pleasantries ran out. "Peter, I need you to understand something," she began, leaning forward with the earnest expression she used when trying to convince me of something important. "When I left you in the hospital, I was scared, terrified actually. I thought our whole life was falling apart and I panicked. So you filed for divorce and started planning a new life with another man. That's how you respond to panic?" She flinched but pressed on. "I know it looks calculating, but it wasn't. Richard was someone I could talk to, someone who listened when I was worried about our future. One thing led to another, and before I knew it, I was making decisions based on fear instead of love." The performance was impressive. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears. Her voice carried just the right note of regret and vulnerability. If I hadn't spent 15 years learning to read her moods and motivations, I might have believed it was genuine. "And now?" I asked. "Now I realize I threw away the most important thing in my life. You, our marriage, everything we built together." She reached across the table as if to take my hand, but I pulled back. "I know I hurt you, Peter. I know I have a lot to make up for, but we can start over. We can build something even stronger than what we had before." "Because I have money now." "No." The word came out louder than she intended, drawing glances from nearby tables. She lowered her voice. "No, because I realize that money doesn't matter if you're not with the right person. Richard has everything I thought I wanted, but he's not you." It was a masterful performance, carefully calibrated to hit every emotional note. The problem was that I'd heard variations of this speech before, whenever she needed something from me or wanted to smooth over some conflict. "Tell me about Richard," I said. She looked confused. "What do you mean?" "I mean, tell me about your relationship with him, how it started, how it developed. I'd like to understand the timeline." Her discomfort was immediate and obvious. Does that really matter now? It's over between us. Humor me. She took a sip of her coffee, buying time to construct her answer. We met at the charity auction about 18 months ago. At first, we were just friends. He was going through a difficult divorce, and I was feeling neglected in our marriage. 18 months. Not the 1 year she'd claimed when they visited my apartment. When did it become romantic? I don't see why. When, Abigail? About 6 months ago. She said it quickly, like ripping off a bandage. But it wasn't planned. It just happened. 6 months ago. Which meant she'd been having an affair with Richard while I was still working, still supporting our lifestyle, still believing we were building a life together. The hospital abandonment hadn't been a panic response to changed circumstances. It had been the execution of a plan she'd been developing for months. Did you love him? The question seemed to surprise her. I thought I did. But I was confused, angry about our problems. I wasn't thinking clearly. What problems? You know what problems. The money stress, your lack of ambition, the feeling that we were stuck in place while everyone around us was moving forward. There it was again. My lack of ambition. The fundamental character flaw that had supposedly justified everything that followed. So you decided to trade up. That's not fair. Isn't it? Richard made more money, had better prospects, could provide the lifestyle you wanted. You left me for a better offer. That's the definition of trading up. Her composure was starting to crack. The careful mask of regret and vulnerability was slipping, revealing the cold calculation underneath. Fine, she said, her voice hardening. Maybe it started that way. Maybe I was thinking about practical things like financial security and social standing, but that doesn't mean we can't fix this now. Why would I want to fix it? Because you love me. Because we have 15 years of history together. Because I'm willing to admit I was wrong and try to make it right. You're willing to admit you were wrong now that I have $10 million. The number hit her like a physical blow. Her coffee cup rattled against the saucer as she set it down with trembling hands. 10 million? She whispered. 10,200,000 to be more precise, plus ownership of a company worth approximately 40 million. So yes, Abigail, everything is different now, just not in the way you're hoping. She stared at me across the small table, her mind obviously racing to process the implications. $10 million. More money than either of us had ever imagined having, more than enough to provide every luxury she'd ever wanted, every social advantage she'd ever craved. I had no idea, she said finally. Of course you didn't. If you had, you never would have left me in that hospital bed. The accusation hung between us like a toxic cloud. She opened her mouth to deny it, then closed it again. We both knew it was true. That's not... yes, this changes things, but not in the way you think. It just removes the obstacles that were causing problems in our marriage. The obstacles weren't money, Abigail. The obstacle was your character. She recoiled as if I'd slapped her. That's cruel. Is it? You abandoned me when I was injured and vulnerable. You filed for divorce while I was in the hospital. You brought your new boyfriend to my apartment to humiliate me. And now, a week later, you want to reconcile because my financial situation has improved. If that's not a character problem, what would you call it? I would call it human. I would call it making mistakes and trying to fix them. No, Abigail. Making a mistake is forgetting an anniversary or losing your temper during an argument. What you did was calculated, sustained cruelty designed to cause maximum damage at my most vulnerable moment. So what, you're just going to throw away 15 years over this? I'm not throwing anything away. You already did that. The tears started then, but they felt manufactured, performed rather than felt. Peter, please, I know I hurt you, but people can change. I can change. Give me a chance to prove that. You had 15 years to prove that. You showed me exactly who you are when you thought it wouldn't cost you anything. That's not who I really am. Yes, it is. It's exactly who you are. You're someone who sees relationships as transactions, who measures love in dollars and social status. You're someone who can walk away from an injured spouse without a backward glance if it serves your interests." She was crying openly now, but whether from genuine emotion or tactical manipulation, I couldn't tell anymore. Maybe she couldn't tell either. "What about Richard?" I asked. "Have you told him you're here, trying to reconcile with your ex-husband?" The question caught her off guard. No, not yet." "Of course not. Because you're keeping your options open, aren't you? If I take you back, Richard becomes irrelevant. If I don't, you still have your backup plan." "It's not like that." "It's exactly like that. You're hedging your bets, just like you've been doing for months, maybe years." I stood up, pulling out my wallet to pay for the coffee. The conversation was over. There was nothing left to say that would change anything fundamental about who she was or what she'd done. "Peter, wait. Please, just listen to me." I looked down at her sitting there, mascara running slightly, the black dress rumpled from her nervous fidgeting. She looked smaller somehow, diminished in a way that had nothing to do with physical size. "I did listen to you, Abigail. For 15 years I listened to you. I listened when you complained about our income. I listened when you criticized my ambitions. I listened when you explained why you needed more, always more, to be happy. And then I listened in that hospital room when you told me I was useless and jobless and not worth your time." "I didn't mean—" "Yes, you did. You meant every word. And that's why this conversation is pointless. Because nothing has really changed. I just have more money now." I left her sitting there at the table, crying into her coffee cup, while life continued around her. Through the window, I could see people walking past on the sidewalk, going about their normal days, unaware that someone inside was learning the true cost of the choices she'd made. As I walked to my car, I felt something I hadn't expected. Freedom. Not satisfaction, not revenge, not even relief. Just the clean, clear feeling of a burden being lifted. For 15 years I'd carried the weight of trying to make Abigail happy, trying to be worthy of her love, trying to bridge the gap between who I was and who she wanted me to be. Now I finally understood that the gap hadn't been about money or ambition or any external measure of success. It had been about character, about fundamental differences in how we viewed love and loyalty and commitment. She would never understand why her offer to reconcile was insulting rather than generous. She would never see that money couldn't fix what was broken between us, because what was broken was inside her. And for the first time since that awful day in the hospital, I was grateful she'd revealed her true nature when she did, because now I was free to discover who I could become without her constant judgment and disappointment weighing me down. The truth had set me free, and tomorrow I would begin building a life worthy of that freedom. 1 year later, I stood in the office that had once belonged to Harrison Mitchell, looking out over the same city skyline that had intimidated me during my first visit to Meridian Dynamics. The view was the same, but everything else had changed. The office was mine now, decorated with photos of places I'd traveled and books I'd finally had time to read. The mahogany desk held plans for the company's expansion into sustainable logistics, a project that combined profitable business with environmental responsibility. Meridian Dynamics had grown under my leadership. Revenue was up 18%, employee satisfaction had reached an all-time high, and we'd been recognized as one of the city's best places to work. More importantly, I'd learned that success felt different when it was built on your own terms, with your own values guiding the decisions. The knock on my door interrupted my afternoon review of quarterly reports. Margaret Chen peered in, holding a folder of financial projections. "Do you have a few minutes to go over the third quarter numbers?" she asked. "Of course. Come in." Margaret had become more than just my chief financial officer over the past year. She'd become a trusted advisor, someone whose judgment I relied on for both business and personal decisions. Her integrity and competence reminded me daily that not everyone viewed relationships as transactions. "Overall, we're exceeding projections across all departments," she began, spreading the reports across my desk. "Revenue is up, costs are down, and client retention is at 93%. "And Richard's department?" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Performing adequately, meeting targets, but not exceeding them." Richard Donovan had remained with the company, true to his word about being a team player. But the dynamic between us had fundamentally shifted in ways that went beyond simple employer-employee relationships. He worked competently, but without the aggressive ambition that had once defined him. Whether that was wisdom or defeat, I couldn't say. Any issues I should know about? Nothing major. He's been more collaborative with other departments, actually. Less territorial than he used to be. I nodded. Richard had learned, through necessity, if not choice, that his survival depended on cooperation rather than domination. It was a lesson that had probably served him well in other areas of his life. What about his engagement to Abigail? Any updates there? Margaret's expression grew diplomatically neutral. According to office gossip, that's been postponed indefinitely. Apparently there were some complications. I could imagine the complications. Abigail's attempt to reconcile with me had probably created trust issues between them that couldn't be easily resolved. When someone shows you they're willing to abandon their current partner for better financial prospects, it tends to make you question their commitment to your own relationship. I see. Well, as long as his personal life doesn't affect his work performance, it's not my concern. After Margaret left, I returned to the quarterly reports, but my mind drifted to the changes the past year had brought, not just in business, but in every aspect of my life. I'd moved out of the small apartment into a house in the hills overlooking the city. Not a mansion. I had no interest in the kind of ostentatious display that had once impressed Abigail, but a comfortable home with space for the books and art I'd always wanted to collect. The guest room was often occupied by friends visiting from out of town, people I'd reconnected with after years of letting my marriage consume all my social energy. Travel had become a regular part of my life. In the past year, I'd visited places that had once been impossible dreams. A photography safari in Kenya, wine tasting in Tuscany, hiking in New Zealand. Not luxury tours designed to impress others, but genuine experiences that fed my curiosity about the world beyond my previously narrow existence. But perhaps the most significant change was internal. For 15 years, I'd defined myself in relation to Abigail's expectations and disappointments. I'd measured my worth by her satisfaction, my success by her approval. Without that constant, external validation to chase, I'd discovered aspects of my personality that had been dormant for decades. I'd started writing again, something I hadn't done since college. Short essays about business ethics, occasional pieces for trade publications about sustainable practices in logistics. Nothing earth-shattering, but the act of putting thoughts to paper had awakened something I'd forgotten I missed. The phone on my desk rang, interrupting my reflection. My assistant announced that someone was here to see me without an appointment. "Who is it?" I asked. "A woman named Sarah Watson. She says she was your nurse at the hospital last year." Sarah. I smiled, remembering the kind woman who'd brought me coffee and gentle wisdom during the darkest period of my recovery. "Send her up, please." Sarah entered my office looking much as she had a year ago, except that she was out of scrubs and wearing a simple blue dress. Her smile was warm and genuine, the kind that reached her eyes and made you feel immediately welcome. "I hope you don't mind me stopping by without calling first," she said. "I was in the building visiting a friend and someone mentioned you worked here. I had to see for myself." "I'm glad you did. Please sit down. Can I offer you something to drink?" She settled into one of the chairs across from my desk, looking around the office with obvious amazement. "I can't believe this is real. When I knew you in the hospital, you seemed like such a, well, not broken man, but definitely someone whose life had been turned upside down." "That's an accurate assessment. Everything I thought I knew about my life had just been destroyed. And now look at you, CEO of a major company living in what I assume is a much better situation than that studio apartment you mentioned." "Much better. But the external changes aren't the most important ones." She tilted her head, curious. "What do you mean?" I considered how to explain the transformation that had taken place over the past year. "In the hospital, You told me that sometimes the worst thing that happens to us turns out to be the best thing. Do you remember that? I remember. Do you think that turned out to be true? Absolutely. Getting abandoned in that hospital bed was devastating at the time, but it forced me to confront some truths I'd been avoiding for years. Such as? Such as the fact that I'd been living my life according to someone else's definition of success. I'd spent 15 years trying to make my wife happy by becoming someone I wasn't, and it was never enough because her happiness didn't actually depend on me. It depended on external validation that could never be permanently satisfied. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. A lot of people never learn that lesson. They keep trying to fix relationships by changing themselves instead of recognizing when the relationship itself is the problem. Exactly, and the inheritance, the money that changed everything from a practical standpoint, that was just a tool. It gave me the freedom to discover who I actually was when I wasn't constantly trying to prove my worth to someone who would never see it. We talked for another 30 minutes about the changes in my life, about her work at the hospital, about the small moments of human connection that could alter the course of everything that followed. When she prepared to leave, she paused at the door. I'm proud of you, Peter. Not for the business success or the money, but for having the courage to build something authentic after everything fell apart. After she left, I realized that her visit had crystallized something I'd been feeling but hadn't articulated. The past year hadn't been about revenge or proving anything to Abigail and Richard. It had been about recovery in the truest sense, not just healing from injuries, but rediscovering who I was beneath the layers of compromise and accommodation I'd built up over 15 years of marriage. As evening approached, I packed up my work and prepared to head home. But first, I had one stop to make. The cemetery was quiet in the late afternoon light, with long shadows stretching across the well-maintained grounds. I found Uncle Harold's grave easily. I'd been here several times over the past year, bringing flowers and spending a few minutes in silent gratitude. The headstone was simple: Harold James Hartley, beloved brother and uncle. Below that, the dates that marked the beginning and end of a life, lived quietly but meaningfully. I placed a fresh bouquet of daffodils beside the stone and sat on the small bench nearby. Uncle Harold had never married, never had children, never achieved the kind of conventional success that society typically celebrates. But he'd lived according to his own values, built wealth slowly and deliberately, and left behind a legacy that had transformed his nephew's life in ways he probably never imagined. "Thank you," I said quietly to the stone marker. "Not just for the money, though that certainly changed everything, but for showing me that it's possible to live differently, that success doesn't have to look like what everyone else expects." A gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the oak tree overhead, and I chose to interpret it as acknowledgement. Driving home through the city streets, I thought about the future. Meridian Dynamics had opportunities for expansion that excited me. There were places I wanted to travel, books I wanted to write, relationships I wanted to nurture. For the first time in years, the future felt wide open, full of possibilities rather than obligations. My phone buzzed with a text message. For a moment, I worried it might be Abigail. She'd tried to contact me several times over the past few months, though I'd stopped responding. But the message was from David Rodriguez, asking if I was free for dinner tomorrow night. He and his wife were hosting a small gathering for a few colleagues, the kind of casual, social event I'd learned to enjoy. I texted back that I'd be there, then realized something that might have seemed small but felt significant. I was looking forward to it. Not because I felt obligated or because it served some strategic purpose, but because I genuinely enjoyed the company of these people who had become friends rather than just business associates. At home, I poured a glass of wine and sat on the deck overlooking the valley below. The city lights were beginning to twinkle as darkness settled over the landscape. Somewhere down there, Abigail and Richard were probably dealing with the aftermath of their broken engagement, trying to salvage something from the wreckage of their calculated romance. Somewhere else, other people were making the same mistakes I'd made, staying in relationships that diminished them, chasing approval from people incapable of giving it. But their stories were not my story anymore. I'd learned the difference between being alone and being free. Being alone was what I'd felt in that hospital bed, abandoned by the person who was supposed to love me most. Being free was what I felt now, responsible only to myself, answerable only to my own values, building a life that reflected who I actually was rather than who someone else wanted me to be. The phone rang one more time as I was preparing for bed, another unknown number which I almost ignored. But something made me answer. "Peter?" The voice was familiar but unexpected. "This is Harrison Mitchell. I hope I'm not calling too late." "Not at all, Harrison. How are you?" "I'm doing well, thank you. I was calling because I heard some interesting news from Margaret today about our company being named Business of the Year by the Chamber of Commerce." I smiled. The award had been announced that afternoon, recognition for our growth, employee satisfaction, and community involvement. It was validation that success could be measured in more than just profit margins. "It's a nice honor," I said, "though it really reflects the work of everyone on the team." "That's exactly why they gave it to us. Peter, when I sold you controlling interest in Meridian, I hoped you'd be a good steward of what we'd built. But you've exceeded every expectation. You've made the company better while making it more profitable. You've shown that doing well and doing good aren't mutually exclusive." "Thank you. That means a lot coming from you." "I wanted to ask you something. The award ceremony is next month and they have invited you to speak about leadership and business ethics. Are you planning to accept?" I considered the question. A year ago, the thought of giving a speech to a room full of business leaders would have terrified me. But now it felt like an opportunity to share something valuable. "Yes, I think I will." "Excellent. I'll be there to cheer you on." After we hung up, I thought about what I might say in that speech. Something about the difference between success and worth, perhaps. Something about the importance of building a life that reflects your values rather than other people's expectations. Something about the strange grace that can emerge from the worst moments of your life, if you're brave enough to embrace the change they demand. But mostly I thought I'd talk about freedom. The freedom that comes from accepting who you really are, from building relationships based on genuine connection rather than mutual utility, from measuring success by internal peace rather than external validation. I'd learned that happiness wasn't about having enough money to satisfy someone else's demands. It was about having the courage to live according to your own definition of enough. And for the first time in my adult life, I was enough, just as I was, without apology or explanation or the desperate need for anyone else's approval. The silent awakening was complete. I had finally learned to hear my own voice above all the others, and it was telling me that everything I needed to be happy had been inside me all along. I just had to be brave enough to listen.